Welcome to the Power of One. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Goldstein from St. Christopher's Hospital. We're going to touch on many different important topics. Welcome to the show, Doctor. How are you?
I'm doing fine, and thank you so much for inviting me.
You're welcome. Dr. Goldstein, tell the viewers a little bit about yourself, how long you've been a pediatrician, and where you're practicing at now.
Sure. I've been practicing now for a little over 30 years, and I've been a general pediatrician for that entire time. I started initially at a community health center in North Philadelphia, and then moved to St. Christopher's about 15 years ago now. And that's why I've been practicing since then.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about vaccinations. Do you find that parents are open to vaccinations? And then this pandemic that we had with COVID-19, I can only imagine the pushback that you received. And I mean, I can't tell a lie. I was a little hesitant to get the vaccine, I guess because it seems so new, but COVID is not a new virus. So talk to the viewers about vaccines and why they're so important.
Sure. And the virus isn't new, but this strain was new, and it was much more infectious and much more severe than other types of the coronaviruses that we've seen before. In general, people are very open to vaccines, and I would say, maybe once every few months, we have a family that comes in that does not feel comfortable getting vaccines, and we respect that. If parents decide they don't want their kids to receive them, we certainly always try to encourage them to consider, because of all the medical interventions that we can do as physicians, vaccines is one of the most effective. It's done an incredible job of reducing to the point of almost totally eliminating some of the most serious diseases that we have ever had to experience. Smallpox was a terrible scourge for centuries. It no longer exists due to the vaccine. And many of the other vaccines have been so effective that people don't remember or realize how serious some of these illnesses were and still are if you get them, including polio, including tetanus, including even chickenpox, which is a relatively newer one, can have very severe side effects. So vaccines are wonderful, but I will say that certainly with the introduction of a new vaccine, there's always going to be questions and some doubts, and I think that's completely understandable. The strong feeling amongst myself and all of my colleagues was that the vaccine was carefully checked and tested and safe to be given. And incredibly effective. In fact, much more effective than many of the other vaccines that we have. But because it was new, there was a lot of understandable concern and suspicion. And what I tried to explain to families is that there's always a risk whenever you take a medicine. There's actually always a risk every time you step out your door and you get into your car that you might get hit by another car. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't drive your car. And there's always a risk with any vaccine that you could have a bad reaction. But those risks are so tiny. And of course, the risks of not getting the vaccine, in this case, the COVID vaccine, were incredibly huge. And we know now from statistics or analysis of hospitalizations, this is mostly in adults, but that the rate of people who were in the intensive care unit with COVID was about 9 times higher for those who did not receive the vaccine than those that did. So just a huge amount of difference in the risk of possible side effects to the vaccine versus the more likely consequences of getting a terrible illness. Now that's changed. The virus has mutated. The present vaccine is not as effective, and they're coming up with new variants of the vaccine. But it was a huge help in really saving lots of lives.
Yeah, it was that pandemic was unbelievable. And I've never seen anything like that in my lifetime. I do remember my uncle and my dad speaking about polio. And my uncle said, I remember I had to get on the bus and actually go get vaccinated. I don't know whether he said vaccinated or a pill at that time. So I'm thinking polio isn't around anymore. Is it still?
Yeah, that's a great, I think, analogy to what we've gone through now. Polio used to be a horrific scourge, really from the start of the 20th century. Polio became a very severe infection both in Europe and in the States. And for our parents and grandparents, they remember it, and they will tell you that towns became ghost towns because everybody was scared to send their kids to the public pools where it seemed that the infection was passing. It created tremendous fear, tremendous anxiety, and of course, tremendous suffering from those who actually contracted the disease. And then I think it was 1954 where the first vaccine for polio was introduced, and that changed everything. All of a sudden, in the summertime, people were no longer scared to take their children outside. They were no longer scared about their children ending up in what was called an iron lung, was a machine that had to do the breathing for you, or the horrific results of the paralysis that many of the patients who survived had for the rest of their lives. We still have some polio survivors, and they'll tell you that about those days, but it's just a memory now for most people, and that's a great sign of how effective the vaccine has been, or the vaccines, actually two major ones. But it also makes it harder to convince people about the importance of vaccines. We still do see polio in the world, just not in this country for the most part. It's extraordinarily here, but in parts of Asia and Africa, there's still some polio.
Now, when polio hit, was there deaths like it was with COVID? And in your practice, when COVID hit, was this something that you had never seen before in the time of you practicing?
Yeah, so polio, I certainly have never seen as a practicing physician, and that primarily affected kids, although it did get adults. In fact, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president, contracted it, at least we think he did, contracted it at a later age of life. But COVID was different. Physicians and nurses and other healthcare people did just heroic things during this pandemic. And we can now talk about it in the past because we do think that it's gone as a pandemic, but it still is certainly a present infection. But luckily, kids were not that badly affected. So as a pediatrician, I was not nearly at the risk of many of my colleagues who work with adults. And we did see some, but very few kids who contracted COVID that had any serious side effects. There's a particular condition called multi-inflammatory system condition for children that can cause some pretty bad side effects. But those were very rare events in our hospital.
Speaking about vaccines and staying on this very, very important topic, I remember when my children were younger and I would take them to their pediatrician, who I know and love and still talk to this day. She's awesome, Dr. Joanne Koza. I love her to death. And I remember her saying to me, Melanie, you need to get the boys their HPV vaccine. And I had never heard of that. And I can't tell a lie. I didn't do it because I wasn't aware of it. I didn't know what it was for. And she would tell me, like, just a little bit, because of course the doctors have to go in room. And in my mind, I'm like, no, they don't need this vaccine. So let's speak a little bit about the HPV vaccine. And do you think parents like myself made the decision because we weren't able to get that full understanding of it and the importance of it?
Yeah, and I think what we've learned with COVID, even when we went through the full understanding, there was still some suspicion and concern, because anytime you introduce something that's new, people are going to be a little uncertain and a little wary, and I think that's completely appropriate. But HPV stands for human papillomavirus, and that's a virus that's been around for forever in humankind, as far as I know. But we didn't have a vaccine for it until the beginning of the 21st century. And the reason why we love to recommend it to everybody once they've reached the age where it's safe to give is that it's connected to cervical cancer in women. And as you know, that's one of the main types of cancer that it can be fatal for women. And in men, it is also connected to forms of penile cancer and cancer of the mouth and throat areas of the body. So we actually think of that as an anti-cancer vaccine, and that's how we would try to talk about it with families, to explain that this is really to help protect your kids from something that they're not going to experience right now, until they become sexually active. But once they are at risk for getting this, and it can have just horrific long-term consequences. And the vaccine has been incredibly effective. A lot of parents, I think, also felt that because it's a virus that's connected to sexual activity, that I think they sort of worried that by giving the vaccine, somehow we were giving license to their kids to become sexually active, which is really as far from the truth as can be. And studies tell us that that didn't make kids more likely to become sexually active. But I think that was one of the fears that many families had. But it has just been a game changer for this particular infection. And the estimates are, and these are just estimates at this point, but probably a 90% reduction in the number of women that are getting cervical cancer or developing it as they get older. And the warts, which are also associated with it, also a huge reduction in seeing those in teenagers and older people as well too. So I strongly recommend it. I love it when our families are okay with it. But this is true about really any vaccine, Melanie, at least our practice. If someone doesn't want it, we certainly don't force it on them or try to force them to change their minds. We respect the decision, but we also respectfully explain to them why we hope that they'll reconsider sometime down the road.
Yeah, I understand that. Now, Dr. Goldstein, you are located at St. Christopher's, right on Erie Avenue. Gun violence is affecting so many children in the city of Philadelphia. And there are times when I get alerts that says shooting of a young person, which just breaks my heart. And they have been transported to St. Chris. Within your practice over the last few years, have you seen that there have been more of your patients that have been affected by gun violence, more of your patients that are suffering from depression, more of your patients that have been bullied? Because, things change over the years, and like bullying from when I was coming up is so much different than bullying now, with some of these children have to deal with. And then some of them, unfortunately, commit suicide. So touch on those topics for me.
That's way too many topics to touch on at one time, but we'll do our best. So let's go back to the gun violence first. And certainly, anecdotally, the number of families that I see that have either been victims of some kind of gun violence or have a loved one that's been a victim of gun violence has gone up. But so is our awareness about talking about it. I think we've really come to appreciate that this is a true public health crisis. And so certainly as a group of pediatricians, we've become very concerned about making sure we screen for it more. I will tell you that 15, 20 years ago, I didn't ask families about whether they had guns in their home. I didn't check in with them to see if they had lost a loved one due to gun violence. But I've lost it actually may be 4 of my patients in the last 5 to 6 years from gun violence. And that's 4 patients more than cancer and diabetes and pneumonias, deaths from all these other common infections combined. So it's a very serious epidemic, public health epidemic. And I think as pediatricians, we would be remiss if we weren't trying to address it and to talk about it with our families, and really to work on both ends of that situation. One is to try to figure out ways to prevent so much gun violence, and of course the other is to try to deal with the terrible emotional trauma as well as the physical trauma for those who've been victims of gun violence. So that was number one. Well, I've already forgot. What was number 2? You gave me a list. Suicide.
Yeah. So let's speak about bullying and like suicide, because I know that's different now than when you and I were coming up.
Yeah, I think that's true, Melanie. And again, some of this may have to do with how aware of it that we've become, to the point that we ask about it more. So there certainly may have been more present that we just didn't check in about, but we're certainly much more sensitized to it. I think the physical bullying, I think the in-person bullying has probably always been there. And it's unfortunately, as much as I love kids can be very mean to one another. And adults can also do that as well. But I think that the kind of the new element in all this is social media, which is now allowed for
Mhm.
cyberbullying to occur too. So that's, I think, amplified things. And as we all know, once it's on the web, once it's on social media, it never disappears. So people are really just subject to endless, or potentially endless harassment about something that they said or did or what they looked like. And so I think that's amplified the problem tremendously. Um, and there aren't any great answers to how to stop that, but we certainly like to make sure we tell our families about resources. The school system now has a bullying office, believe it or not, that is there to help families, and we always encourage them to confront and talk to the teachers and the principals, because oftentimes the bullying is occurring in school, to figure out ways to try to eliminate the bullying that's going on. But like so many of the things that we see with kids everywhere, but I would say just more intensely in areas of greater poverty and more violence, that it's just more severe, and our kids are suffering because of it. In general, and you kind of referred to this about other mental health needs, the amount of anxiety and depression that I see now as a pediatrician than I saw 15, 20, 30 years ago is it's just a night and day, unfortunately. And we know
Mm.
that social media is a contributor to that, and that people who spend a lot of time on social media are much more likely to develop anxiety and depression. So we again have a greater awareness of mental health illness as an important area to treat. And a lot of us as pediatricians, although we were never trained in this, are now beginning to get training on how to use mental health medications. Although we never
Mm.
like to think of that as the first line, therapy and working on family support systems are so much more important. Just and common sense things like getting enough sleep and getting physical exercise can be
Mm.
huge helps in some situations. But it's reached the point where it is such a common condition for us to address that we really need to be more informed about how to manage that with our families.
And that's so important because the way some of these teens are dealing with their problems, they don't know how to deal with conflict resolution, and it could be because they had untreated trauma.
Yeah.
And that untreated trauma as a child will go with you until you're an adult. And that could result in some very, very, very horrible outcomes. Dr. Goldstein, do you go beyond your practice and beyond your requirements because of what you're seeing today and what we touched on, the gun violence and the mental health illness for youth? You and your colleagues, are you doing great things in the city of Philadelphia to help troubled youth?
Yeah, I will say that it's really hard to measure the impact of what we do, but I will tell you that as a group of pediatricians here, and I think my colleagues over at Children's Hospital work in a similar spirit, we're so dedicated to trying to expand how we touch the lives of our families in positive and constructive ways. Always being respectful of what parents and the children themselves want and believe, but trying to make sure they know about services. And I think, as you know, working in the gun violence area, there's a lot of resources out there, but families don't always know about it. So one of the things that we've done is develop a website where any family can go to get information on resources for a multitude of different issues. If they're having trouble with bullying, with educational services, with rental needs, food insecurity, mental health problems. We have information on our website, which is called Cap for Kids, where any family can access it. And of course, we use it all the time to provide those resources. So one of the things we do is make sure that we stay as connected as we can to what's going on in Philadelphia outside the hospital that can be of services to our families. And that includes now, unfortunately, we have a whole section on gun violence with a list of the different extraordinary, heroic organizations around the city that are really providing solace and support to our families that have been victims. So we do that kind of work by trying to provide those resources. And then we do, all of us have different areas of interest and specialties, but we do spend time outside the hospital, which for all of us is such an important thing to do because it's a very different world than the world inside the exam room. I collaborate with Father's Day Rally Committee, which run by Bilal Qayyum, who does gun buybacks. And so we go out to the community and provide some financial resources for families who are willing to deliver their guns to us. And although it's just a little tiny piece of the gun violence problem, it actually can make a difference in just not having a gun available in the home. For a distraught teen who's depressed or suffering from emotional trauma, who may just on impulse grab a gun that's in the home and shoot themselves. So trying to eliminate some of those guns is so huge. And also because kids find and play with guns. And we know in Philadelphia there were, I believe, 3 or 4 fatalities from children shooting other children, of course, accidentally. But it's because guns were left in the home. One of my patients suffered a severe accident because he played with a gun in the home. And that leads to months and months of therapy and surgery. So, it's a different way that we try to reach out to the community by going out in the community and working on programs like that. We have a terrific reach out and read program. So you shouldn't have got me on this because I have all sorts of stuff to talk about. But we have a reach out and read program, which is a national program, but we've expanded to include kids of all age. But we recognize that reading is such a fundamentally important part of kids having a productive and healthy education. And if reading is introduced at an early enough age, it really can make a difference in school performance. And school performance can make a huge difference in how kids make their way through life. So we give out books to every single child who comes in, and we have fundraisers to support that program on an annual basis as well. We do postpartum depression screening because we recognize that those sorts of effects are there in kids. And I think the overall feeling is that kids are just really incredible, and they're resilient, and their families are unbelievable, and their parents and their grandparents, who oftentimes play the role of parents, are extremely strong. But they do get some benefit from having a little bit of guidance and assistance along the way. So that's what we try to do. I also go out to some of the schools and teach. I used to teach before I went into pediatrics, and
Certainly.
this do is the most important job that anyone can do with kids. So I try to go back into the schools and do some teaching as part of what I think is my responsibility as a physician too.
That is awesome. So before we wrap up, speak to those parents who do not think it's important to take their child to their pediatrician or miss appointments. Tell them the importance of their child's health.
Yeah, I think we were just touching on that a little bit, Melanie, but especially in the first 2 years of life, that's such a crucial time when the brain is developing that you want to try to, you don't want kids in a bubble, but you want to try to ensure that they're getting the nutrition that they need, that they're getting the social stimulation that will help them grow in a healthy way. And again, vaccines are part of our armamentarium, but to make sure the kids get the vaccines that they need to protect them from pretty serious illnesses. Our role changes as kids get older because we become more involved with and thoughtful about what's going on in school and behavioral things as they develop. Identifying children with autism, we didn't talk about that, but that's another really rising area of concern over the last 30, 40 years. The incidence of autism has gone way up, but identifying that at an early age or some other developmental problem with language and speech and providing them with services for that can just make a huge difference in their prognosis down the road. I oftentimes tell the residents who we teach here that it's really easy for us to give advice to parents. It's not always easy to follow the advice we give, and I think this is a case of that. Of course, we want every family to bring their child in for every visit, but there are so many barriers. There's transportation problems. There's when we're open and available to be seen. There's the fact that they have a whole other life outside of bringing their kids to the doctor. They may be working, they may have other kids to take care of, that it's very hard for even the most involved and thoughtful and concerned parents to always bring their kids in. But we really do encourage them, please try to come in, and we certainly make every effort we can to make sure that we create as an accessible system as possible. But it is a problem that it's not always easy to get appointments, and there's a lot of logistical issues trying to get your kids to a doctor's visit. So yes, as a doctor, not just because that's how I make my money, but it's because I really believe in it. child's health is so crucial to the future of our country and our community, that I want every parent to do that. And I will tell you, Melanie, I am in awe every day when I see families. There are long days, and sometimes I don't leave here till 8 or 9 o'clock. But I am humbled by what I see when these families come in, and I talk to the parents who describe some of the things they've been going through and the efforts they've made to protect their children and nurture their children. And every one of them is a hero. None of them will be in the paper, and none of them will get a medal, but they all should. And I think, we focus so much on the negatives of all the things that are happening to our kids. We forget sometimes to emphasize the positives of unbelievably strong, loving parents who do such a wonderful job making sure their kids are healthy. So although I like to say that we're important in the process, of course, the family is much more important to their overall health.
That's amazing. That is amazing. And thank you so much. And yes, we would like to say to all of those parents that are doing what they do, not because they're required to do it as a parent, but because they love their children. So yes, you are unsung heroes. So parents, keep pressing on, and we know it's hard, but when you have great pediatricians like Dr. Goldstein in your corner and helping you, if you're in need of any resources, lean on him and the pediatricians that care for the other children, lean on them, because we all need help at some point in our lives. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Goldstein.
You're welcome. I love talking to you, Melanie. Maybe we can do this another time.
Thank you so much for joining me and Dr. Goldstein today. We covered so much on vaccinations. It is extremely important that you speak to your child's pediatrician, ask questions, and understand everything about those vaccinations before you make your choice. But Dr. Goldstein said they're very, very crucial to making sure that your child stays healthy. Peace and love.